The O'Connor family had planned their vacation for months, an escape from the monotony of everyday life. For Claudia and Thomas, married for 35 years, this trip to the coast was meant to celebrate their anniversary, a getaway to their favorite beach town, a place where memories were tucked into the sand and sun. They'd rented a beautiful house on a cliffside, overlooking the endless blue of the ocean. Their 2 grown children, Vanessa and Colin, joined them, along with their families, filling the house with the laughter of grandchildren and the clinking of glasses. On the surface, everything was perfect, but Claudia had started to feel a strange dissonance, a tension that seemed to come in waves. Late one night, unable to sleep, Claudia walked out onto the terrace, the ocean breeze lifting her hair. It was there that she overheard the voices, a woman's, lilting and intimate, and Thomas's unmistakable low murmur. She couldn't see them in the darkness, only hear the tones. But they had a rhythm she recognized, a cadence that could only come from familiarity. She knew her husband's laugh. She knew the flirtation in it. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining things, so absurd did it seem in that tranquil place. But as she listened to him murmur words meant for someone else, the truth slowly flooded her like the waves crashing below. When Thomas finally came inside, she was waiting for him in the dimly lit kitchen, her gaze cold and unflinching. She had questions she never imagined she'd have to ask him, suspicions she'd never wanted to entertain. He flinched at her accusations, a momentary flash of guilt betraying him before he managed to cover it with anger and denial. But the facts began to emerge, layer by painful layer. A woman named Laura, younger, lively, an escape from the weight of a long marriage, he claimed in a defensive tone. He admitted, not without resentment, that he had needed a different kind of connection, something less heavy, something less real. The confession struck Claudia in ways she hadn't prepared for, anger boiling beneath the betrayal. 35 years, a lifetime shared, a bond built on trust, had been broken on a whim. She thought of their children, their grandchildren, and felt the ground beneath her tremble, their whole family legacy suddenly at stake. Days passed, and the truth was carefully hidden from the rest of the family, who sensed only a strained silence. But Claudia couldn't let it go, couldn't bear the weight of it without some sort of justice. One morning, as the others left for an early swim, she confronted him once more. This time, her words were cold, deliberate, as she asked him what he planned to do. She watched his face contort, unable to decide between remorse and frustration. He had been content to keep his indiscretion tucked into a private corner, never intending to let it surface, much less let it affect his real life, as he called it. The final evening arrived, a family dinner arranged as a formal farewell to the trip. Claudia prepared everything, dressed impeccably, her calm demeanor betraying nothing of her simmering fury. Midway through dinner, as the candles flickered, Claudia lifted her glass to make a toast. She thanked her family for the beautiful memories, for the love shared and cherished. And then, looking directly at Thomas, she offered a cold smile, letting everyone know that she had learned just how precious their bond truly was, and how easy it was for some to forget it. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks flushed as her words hung heavy in the air. The children looked at one another, puzzled, sensing the undercurrent of tension, but unable to grasp its depth. In that silent moment, Claudia realized her power. She wouldn't be the one to destroy their family. That burden belonged to him. As the family packed up the next day, Claudia let him see the resignation in her eyes, a silent promise that she wouldn't let him forget his betrayal. This was his punishment, He would carry the weight of his actions every day, and the family he had once built with pride would be a reminder of what he'd nearly lost. Claudia remained silent, bearing her dignity as her shield, leaving Thomas to wonder when, if ever, the consequences of his actions would truly unravel. Back home, the silence between Claudia and Thomas grew into a wall, invisible but palpable. Their house, once warm and filled with shared history, felt like a carefully curated museum, each room a place to hide in, rather than to live. She didn't speak of his affair, didn't bring it up in arguments or passive-aggressive remarks. Instead, she wore her silence like armor, letting it sink into the air between them, a constant reminder of the betrayal that lingered unspoken. She knew it gnawed at him, saw it in his restless movements, his forced attempts to engage her in small talk, his sidelong glances when he thought she wasn't looking. Thomas tried to reconcile, offering gestures of apology, a bouquet of her favorite flowers, a surprise dinner reservation, even an awkward proposal to renew their vows. But every attempt bounced off her cold resolve. She didn't want the flowers, the dinners, or the empty promises. She wanted him to feel the weight of her pain, the devastation of his thoughtless betrayal. One evening, as autumn set in and the first frost coated the ground outside, Claudia was sitting alone in the living room when she heard his footsteps. He hovered near the doorway, hesitant, his silhouette outlined in the dim light. She continued reading, pretending not to notice, forcing him to clear his throat and speak. "Claudia, please. Can we talk?" She looked up, taking in the weariness in his face, the lines of guilt etched deep around his eyes. For the first time, she felt a twinge of satisfaction in seeing his suffering, an unsettling sense of power. She nodded, closing her book and folding her hands in her lap. "Talk," she said coolly. He stumbled over his words, offering a litany of apologies, half-explanations, promises that sounded hollow even as he spoke them. He was weak, he admitted, ashamed. He had been tempted by something that seemed easier than facing the realities of a long marriage. He swore he regretted it, swore he would do anything to undo the pain he had caused. Claudia listened impassively, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound punctuating his words. When he finished, she regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Thomas," she said finally, her voice steady, "you've always taken things for granted. Our marriage, our family, the life we built together. You've taken me for granted." Her words struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He began to speak, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "You don't get to erase this, not with flowers or apologies. This is yours to live with. And I want you to know," she added, her voice turning sharper, "that I won't pretend to forgive you. I won't let you think that I've forgotten, or that I'll ever let this go." The finality in her tone drained the blood from his face. Claudia knew he understood, truly understood, the depth of his mistake. She saw a glimmer of the man she'd fallen in love with 35 years ago, humbled and broken, but it didn't bring her any comfort. If anything, it made her loss more profound. From that day forward, they resumed their lives with a new, unspoken arrangement. They remained together, outwardly the same devoted couple they had always appeared to be. Claudia joined him at social events, hosted family gatherings, and smiled in photos. But there was a distance between them that could never be bridged. Thomas had broken something in her, and in their life together, that would remain shattered forever. Yet Claudia was no martyr. She threw herself into new activities, traveled alone and reconnected with old friends. She let herself become slowly but deliberately, a woman who did not depend on her husband for her happiness. She crafted a new life within the ruins of their marriage, a quiet life, but one marked by strength and self-respect. As years passed, she became a figure of intrigue among her friends and neighbors, a woman of poise and grace, whose calm demeanor held secrets only she would ever know. And while Thomas lived each day by her side, he was haunted by a constant reminder of his betrayal, a life sentence of silent regret, watching as Claudia slipped further from his grasp. In the end, it was not revenge she sought, nor forgiveness. It was her freedom, and in her silent strength, she found it. As the years continued to pass, Claudia's newfound independence flourished. She took up painting, spending hours in a studio she'd carved out in their attic, her canvases filled with vivid colors and restless strokes. Art became an outlet for the feelings she could never express in words: grief, anger, a bittersweet nostalgia for the life they once had. Her paintings were abstract, turbulent, reflecting a world only she understood. Thomas, meanwhile, remained a shadow in her life, present but increasingly inconsequential. He would occasionally venture upstairs to watch her paint, offering soft-spoken compliments or murmuring about how he admired her new work. Claudia acknowledged him with polite nods, but her gaze remained fixed on the canvas, her hands continuing their strokes as if he wasn't there. This new life of hers was separate from him, a world of her own making. Their children, Vanessa and Colin, sensed the shift in their parents' marriage, though they never spoke of it openly. Vanessa, always intuitive, visited more often, asking her mother quiet, concerned questions about her well-being. Colin, on the other hand, kept his distance, perhaps preferring not to see the reality that had reshaped their family. Claudia and Thomas continued to play the part of a united front for family gatherings. But even the grandchildren noticed something different. One evening, several years after the confrontation that had shattered their marriage, Thomas fell ill. It was sudden, a heart condition that seemed to have emerged overnight. Claudia found him one morning, slumped over in his office chair, his face ashen, a hand pressed to his chest in pain. In that instant, a rush of emotions flooded her, a tangle of worry, anger, and a strange, reluctant tenderness. She called an ambulance, and in the tense hours that followed, she sat by his side in the hospital, watching him in silence. In the sterile glow of the hospital room, he looked smaller, frailer, and Claudia was struck by how much they had both changed. Time had softened his face, and beneath the years of anger, she saw a glimpse of the man he had once been. He opened his eyes, blinking at the bright lights, and when he saw her, he reached out, his hand trembling. "Claudia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know I've ruined us. I know it's too late, but I've never stopped. I never stopped loving you." His words were halting, heavy with regret. She watched him, her face expressionless. "Thomas, I believed in us once. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it away. I've had to rebuild my life because of what you did." She paused, her gaze unyielding. "But I didn't do it for you. I did it for me." A silence settled over the room, and he looked away, his hand slipping back to his side. Claudia felt a pang of sadness, but it was distant, dulled by the years and the resilience she'd cultivated. She realized that in some strange way, she had already forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. Forgiveness, she had come to understand, was not about absolving him. It was about setting herself free from the chains of his betrayal. Thomas recovered, though he was never quite the same, and in the months that followed, Claudia continued to live as she had, on her own terms. She sold some of her paintings, began attending gallery shows, and found herself surrounded by friends who admired her strength. She knew she'd become something of an enigma, a woman whose silent resilience intrigued others, though they rarely asked for the whole story. In the end, she and Thomas shared a quiet companionship. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no declarations of rekindled love. Instead, there was a mutual understanding, a truce of sorts, shaped by shared memories and silent regret. They moved forward in parallel lives, side by side but forever apart, each haunted by the life they could have had. Claudia had lost something irretrievable, a life once intertwined with her husband's, but in its place, she had gained herself, and in that self-discovery, she found a peace that no apology could ever bring. For the first time, she felt whole, strong, independent, and free. Years drifted by, and Claudia embraced a quiet, contented life, her identity firmly rooted in the independence she had fought so hard to reclaim. She grew older gracefully, a figure of elegance and strength, her presence respected and admired by everyone who knew her. Her home had become a sanctuary for her art and her memories, a place filled with vibrant canvases, a garden blooming under her care, and walls that told a story of resilience. Thomas, now visibly frail, spent more time in solitude, moving about the house like a ghost of the man he had once been. He had, over time, resigned himself to Claudia's distance, carrying his remorse like a hidden wound. Though they shared a home, they had both settled into an unspoken acceptance of what could never be repaired. The weight of his choices hung in the air, a shadow neither of them acknowledged aloud. One day, as winter's chill settled over the town, Claudia received news that Thomas had collapsed in his study. She found him there, breathing faintly, his gaze unfocused. For a moment, she was transported back to that fateful day in the hospital, years ago, when he had first shown his vulnerability to her. This time, however, there was no hesitation in her. She knelt beside him, holding his hand as he looked at her with a mixture of sadness and gratitude, knowing these were likely his final moments. "Claudia," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Thank you for staying by my side, even when I didn't deserve it." She looked at him, and to her surprise, her heart softened, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. She had come to terms with her pain, rebuilt herself from the ruins he had left. She was stronger now, and he was a man who had learned, far too late, the consequences of a single selfish act. She reached out, gently brushing his graying hair from his forehead, her touch as tender as it once had been in their youth. "There was a time, Thomas, when you were everything to me," she said quietly, her voice steady. "And then, you became a part of the story I had to leave behind. But I have my life, my family, my memories. I'm grateful for that." She held his gaze, seeing the acceptance in his eyes. As the minutes passed, his breathing slowed, and in those last moments, they shared a rare, bittersweet peace. Claudia stayed with him as he slipped away, her hand resting on his, witnessing the final chapter of their story together. She felt a strange lightness, a release that came not from loss, but from a deep, quiet acceptance. In the days that followed, Claudia gathered her family close, leaning on their warmth and love, sharing memories of Thomas with laughter and nostalgia. She mourned him, not as the man who had broken her heart, but as someone who had, in his own flawed way, helped shape the person she had become. With Thomas gone, Claudia continued her life, not as a widow bound by loss, but as a woman who had come to know her worth, her resilience, and her power to forgive, not to forget, but to be free. She poured her love and strength into her art, her family, and herself, her life a testament to survival and self-discovery. In the end, Claudia had found her own story, one of grace and quiet triumph. She was finally beautifully whole.